Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of purple mountain majesties above the fruit.
10 Good Men, Part 2. This is a list of persons that, in my view, were among the most influential Vermilionites of the early 20th century. It's an idea I've been playing with for some time. But honestly and truly, there are so many to choose from, the task is realistically impossible. For one thing, it's entirely subjective. I chose 10 men that I think were the most influential. Someone else might choose others. And that's okay. But some might agree that those I put on my list were at least among the many who made positive contributions to the development of our community during the early years of the last century.
And there is no pecking order here. I don't think one person did more than others. All contributed in their own ways. As I see it, it was oddly enough an concerted effort by each. Vermilion, spelled with 2 L's at the end of the 19th century, is often called the city of lake captains. The name beckons back the days when sailing vessels were born along the banks of the river, and the men and crews that built and sailed them populated the town. But by the end of the century, the boat-building industry had dramatically declined, and commercial fishing, an industry that had been around since folks first settled in the area, began to grow. In 1854, a German immigrant named Adam Kishman, whose farm bordered the lake, near the area that much later became the site of the Lorraine Ford plant, purchased a scow with a man-powered drop hammer. With it, he drove pilings into the lake bottom just off the beach. He fastened some fish nets to those pilings and went into the business of fishing. It is a process called seine fishing. Early every morning, before their duties in the field had begun, 2 farm workers would launch a dory from the beach, one operating the oars, the other steering and removing the fish from the nets. Upon returning to shore with their bounty, the fish were packed in ice that had been harvested from the lake during the winter. They were then placed into storage. Some of the fish were packed in boxes and taken to the Brownhelm station to be shipped by train to other parts of the country. The remainder was either sold locally or purchased by peddlers who took them by horse and wagon over the very corduroy roads to markets as far away as Worcester. Adam's oldest son, Henry, began working on the farm and the fishery as early as 1872. But by 1876, 3 of Adam's 5 sons, Henry, along with his brothers Edward and Charles, had left farming and had become involved in the commercial fishing business full-time. Innovations in the fishing operation over the years induced the boys to forego the inherent difficulties in the old shore shuttle fishing style with a dory to that of using sailboats that allowed them to set nets out further in the lake. Then, with the arrival of steam-powered boats and the advent of gill nets in the latter part of the 19th century, the boys abandoned the shore operation altogether and moved to a new location on the Vermilion River. The approximate site of this concern was just southwest of the current Vermilion River Bridge. Henry managed the fish house and retail end of the business, and Edward captained their steam tug telephone. Charles left for Lorraine to run the Booth Company's fishery. At the turn of the century, Edward left the Vermilion fishery and, with the financial support of some Sandusky men, began to manage a new fishery located in Huron. Brother Henry took a manager position with Vermilion's Driscoll Fish Company. The Driscoll Company was situated on the west bank of the river, north of the river bridge, in a place that eventually became Parsons Boat Marina/storage. In 1905, Henry, who had found his work with Driscoll to be less than agreeable, purchased the Edson and Nichols River front property about a quarter-mile north of the Driscoll houses. It was in this spot the business officially known as the Kishman Fish Company of Vermilion was born, thrived, and grew into one of the most successful fisheries on Lake Erie. In 1909, Edwards Company in Huron joined the Vermilion operation. Henry was elected company president and Edward vice president. 3 years later, they assumed control of another fishery in Grand Harbor, and brother Charles joined them as manager of that concern. The name Kishman is now synonymous with commercial fishing in Vermilion and all along the northern shores of Lake Erie. During the period Lake Erie historians now refer to as the Golden Age of the industry, the Kishman family owned and operated fisheries in Grand Harbor, Huron, and, of course, Vermilion. The story of how this came to be is purely an American story, wherein success is a consequence not only of good fortune, but also of intelligence and hard work. The Kishman brothers worked the family business together for the remainder of their lives. Edward died in 1944, and Charles passed away 2 years later. While Henry remained president of the company until his death in 1948, his son, Lester, who had joined the business in 1931, took over management in 1935, eventually assuming his father's post as the head of the company. When Lester retired on December 31, 1959, local resident Ray Full became company president. Over 100 years have passed since Adam Kishman pushed his old dory off the beach of his farm to collect his first harvest from Lake Erie. The consequence of that rather mundane action was but the first step in the realization of a story of success that is purely and unconditionally American.
A.D. Bombard. He was born in 1873 on a farm on the west side of Vermilion. At the age of 8 years, I became afflicted with a tubercular hip and didn't leave the yard again for 3 years. This rendered me too delicate for farm work, so work was found for me in a grocery store. I was transferred to a dry goods and general store where I remained for about 6 months. About that time, my brother opened a drugstore, and I became his assistant and served an apprenticeship lasting 7 years. After that, I attended the College of Pharmacy. Upon leaving the college, I went to Berea and worked in a drugstore for nearly a year. Salary $50 per month, which, by the way, was the largest salary I ever received. Returning to Vermilion, I bought the Quigley store, then located on Division Street, where All Heights Sick Hardware store now stands. In 1898, I made a contract with the Bell Telephone Company to put in the first telephone exchange in Vermilion. The contract provided that I was to furnish the heat, light, office room, and proper operators to handle the business. The exchange opened March 18, 1898, with 19 subscribers. This grew rapidly until about 200 subscribers were obtained. This remained in my drugstore for about 12 years. On December 3, 1903, our store burned, catching fire from other buildings in a frame row. The fire occurred about 4 o'clock, so we had time to remove part of the drug stock. In less than an hour, I had purchased the Harris drugstore, then located where Rathbun's store now is, and by 7 o'clock the next morning was doing business in the new location. All telephone subscribers were in working order by 7 o'clock next evening. The following spring, the Lakeshore Electric line opened, and I was made ticket agent and electric package agent. My stay here lasted 2 years, and then the store was moved into a part of the room now occupied by Norman Ness. Note, this refers to one of the shops beneath the Masonic Temple on the west side of Main Street, a few doors south of Liberty Avenue. After another period of 7 years, I found this room to be too small, so I built and moved into my present location on June 23, 1916. My school life was begun in the State Street brick building. 2 years later, I was transferred to a building known as the Old Seminary, a frame structure of 2 rooms which occupied the site where the water tower now stands. The building is still in existence and is now occupied by Harry Mead, the plumber. Note, the water tower stood in Hanover Square. When it was built, the school was moved to a new site on the east side of Grand Street between Liberty and the railroad tracks. It was eventually torn down. Later, I was transferred to the brick building again, where I continued in school until the course was completed. Although I finished the high school course and not being convinced that I should write an oration to be delivered from the stage platform of the town hall on commencement night, I quit school 2 weeks ere the term ended to embark on the pill rolling game. This, of course, was a bad mistake, for it cost me to go through life without possessing a high school diploma. Imagine what would have happened to my boys should they have suggested such a procedure to me. If I remember correctly, another member of our Rotary Club did a similar thing to go sailing. I, too, tried my hand at sailing, but after having my feelings hurt by the mate and getting seasick, I got off the boat after one trip when it tied up at Ashtabula, glad to return to the long hours of the drugstore in preference to life on the briny deep. The last night out was the fatal night on which the steamer Western Reserve went down with all hands except one. In 1906, I was married to F.E.C. Washburn, who passed away on November 1st, 1918. On August 15th, 1921, I married my present wife, Frances L. Bullock of Cadiz, Ohio. I am the father of 2 sons, A.D. Bombard Jr. and Charles Wheeler.
Let me call you sweetheart, I'm in love with you. Let me hear you whisper that you love me too.
Vermilion, March 2nd, 1922. The funeral of 58-year-old Edward L. Cohen, organizer, and for many years the mainspring of the Vermilion Banking Company, will be held here Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Bankers and others prominent in financial circles throughout Ohio will attend. Cohen, who was active in the business and social life of Vermilion since locating here in 1891, died Saturday night at 10:30 at his home. For some time, he had been in poor health. He was the first child in a family of 9 children to pass away. His brother, F.W., is vice president and general manager of the Lakeshore Electric. Much of the following is from Peake's History of Erie County pertaining to Mr. Cohen. A prominent figure in Ohio banking affairs and one especially influential in furthering financial and other business activities in Erie County is Edward Cohen. He has been the chief executive of the Erie County Banking Company of Vermilion during the entire period of its existence. He was formerly cashier of this solid and well-ordered banking institution and is now the first vice president. Born in Fulton County, Indiana, January 24, 1864, Mr. Cohen passed his boyhood and youth in the country. His early education advantages were those of the public schools of his home township at the high school at Rensselaer, Indiana. He was a good student and made the use of his opportunities. For years he was a teacher in the schools of his home county. Soon after he reached his majority, he went to southwestern Kansas and for nearly 4 years was engaged in the real estate and farm insurance business. He was also one of the founders of Ford County, Kansas during the late 80s. After leaving Kansas, Mr. Cohen spent a year in the Rock Island and Pacific Railway in Chicago, and in April 1891 took up his residence in Vermilion. Here he effected the organization of the Erie County Bank of Vermilion. The following year, this institution was incorporated as a state bank in the present title. The Erie County Banking Company was adopted. An expert financier. Since the time the practical management of the bank revolved upon Mr. Cohen, who was in many ways an exemplary banker and an expert financier. When the bank was organized, he became cashier, a position he held until August 19, 1915. Since 1903, he has also been first vice president and has given the bank the benefit of his broad experience even after resigning his position as cashier. Mr. Cohen is also a recognized leader in Ohio banking circles. From 1907 to 1918, he served as secretary-treasurer of Group No. 6, and from 1910 to 1913 as chairman of the group in the Ohio Bankers Association. During his term as group chairman, he was also a member of the Council of Administration and served as chairman during 1913. He served as vice president of the Bank Ohio Bankers Association in 1914 and as president in 1915. Also a telephone man. Mr. Cohen was also the primary force in affecting the organization and incorporation of the Vermilion Telephone Company and was president and director since it was organized. He was also a director and treasurer of the Gallia Telephone Company in Gallipolis, Ohio. He served 15 years on the Vermilion Board of Education and was president for several years. In politics, he was a Republican. He was also a member of the Congregational Church of Vermilion. In 1893, Mr. Cohen married Miss Cora Lawless, the daughter of the late Captain James Lawless of Vermilion. The couple had 2 sons, Edward M., and another son, Clarence L., who died at the age of 4.5.
Mr. Cohen died on the 25th day of March in 1922. He was only 58 years old.
Let me call you sweetheart, I'm in love with you.
I remember Elton Fisher. But my memories of him are those through the eyes of a little boy, perhaps I was 8 or 10 years old, and they are clouded by all the people and years that have passed since. This Elton I do not remember. Nor would it be possible. This photo of Mr. Fisher is taken in perhaps 1917 or 18. He would have been in his mid-20s when these shadows were forever cast in time. His granddaughter, Bobby Riley, thought him a very handsome man. Here he's standing beside a fire chief gasoline pump in front of his new garage and showroom for his Chevrolet Buick dealership. His father George stands in the foreground. Their faithful pup poses thoughtfully at his feet. And a garage employee relaxes in a chair at the dealership entrance. Elton Lieberman Fisher, Lieberman was his mother's maiden name, was born February 23, 1893 in Vermilion. He was the only son of George and Elizabeth Lizzie Fisher. They also had a daughter they named Maud. Nicholas Fisher was their grandfather. Both Nicholas and George were lumbermen. Nicholas was a wholesale lumberman who worked the virgin forests of Ohio and Kentucky. And while son George followed in his footsteps, he was also well educated, a lawyer and businessman, starting a retail lumber company on the shores of the Vermilion River. He was, in a word, successful. I've no idea as to how long Elton kept his automobile dealership, but in time he apparently sold his share of the business to a partner, Albert Waddy Stone, and the business was moved from the location in this picture to a new building up the street, beside what is now Rudy's Bar and Grill, and renamed Stone's Garage. This is the brick structure directly across the street from Vermilion's Ritter Library. I have been told that before Stone built the existing building that the old Andy Marks home on South Perry Street occupied the site. Stone's business, incidentally, eventually evolved into Sharpnack's Chevrolet dealership.
In any case, Elton eventually assumed the responsibilities inherent in operating his father's lumber company. In January of 1938, a great fire consumed the business along the river, and Elton rebuilt on the opposite side of the road. At the beginning of World War II, he sold the company. It would in time become the Crow Lumber Company. Mr. Fisher owned and managed a considerable amount of property during his lifetime. He sold one of his properties to the federal government to erect Vermilion's first freestanding post office during the late 1950s. He was a Vermilion volunteer fireman, and like many other men in the village, was a member of the local post of the American Legion and Masonic Lodge. He was also an active member of the Sandusky Elks Club. He and his wife, Ruth, had a daughter, Virginia Oler, who passed away in 2006 in California, and a granddaughter, Roberta Bobby Riley. Ms. Riley has, over the years, contributed a good deal of information regarding the history of the family in Vermilion and elsewhere. During World War I, Elton served in both the U.S. Army and the Merchant Marines. The patch on his uniform in the photo has the initials USTC. After searching through numerous sources, in an attempt to discover the meaning of the initials, I, at this time, conclude that he was part of a special training unit that was created during the First War specifically concentrating on training businessmen to be officers in the Army. If anyone knows better, or more, about such matters, I'd appreciate hearing from them. But however you cut it, Elton Lieberman Fisher was a very special person. He went to his final home in October of 1960 at the rather young age of 67 years. And the shadows he cast across Vermilion's yesteryear are unlikely to be forgotten.
Don't forget your hat, but leave your worries, leave 'em on the doorstep. Life's sweet, just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. Up bottle doodles there.
F.W. Wakefield, Thursday, the 6th of December, 08. Alice Wakefield was kind enough to email me this Rockwellian snapshot of her grandfather, F.W. Wakefield, with sons Ernest and Ted, aboard the Tobermory II in 1924. It is the best photo I have of the Wakefield family patriarch. And, believe it or not, the identities of the persons in it really wouldn't matter if I were simply looking at it as an art critic. It's a great photo. F.W. Wakefield, from a very objective point of view, was very likely the most influential person in Vermilion, Ohio, during the 20th century. If one seriously looks at his accomplishments as an inventor, innovator, industrialist, and community leader, it is doubtful that there were many other Vermilionites, aside from, perhaps, George Fisher, who contributed more to the positive development of the place known as Vermilion, Ohio, during the last century. To be certain, there are many great community leaders in Vermilion. And to be equally certain, there are a good number of hard-working men and women who, together, forge a positive future for the community. But Mr. Wakefield's accomplishments were exceptional even by today's standards. Or, perhaps, better said, in spite of today's standards. One must realize that Wakefield was not a Vermilion native. And it may be that allowed him more insight into the potential of the community than those who had been born and raised therein. The first prospectus for Vermilion, Ohio as a great place for businesses to locate was undoubtedly of his design. That prospectus remains a significant historical document. Wakefield was constantly trying to bring additional industry into the community, be it on land or on water. Dahl Motors was one of his success stories. Note, Dahl Ford of Elyria was an offshoot of that original business begun in Vermilion. Both the Vermilion Boat Club and the South Shore Regattas are vestiges of Mr. Wakefield's initiatives for a positive future for the community. He gave credit where credit was due by honoring veterans and volunteer workers throughout the community as the years passed. And the inventions and innovations of his company in the lighting industry in both war and peace are well known. To be very sure, F.W. Wakefield became a wealthy person. But the one thing he never became was arrogant. Vermilion, Ohio was his hometown, populated by good people he respected, and for whom and with he was willing to work. To borrow a thought from the American singer, songwriter, novelist, and politician, K. Friedman, money can buy you a fine dog. But only love can make him wag his tail.